The Missouri Review was born in 1978, partly out of a romance. The magazine's founders, Marcia Southwick and Larry Levis, were poets at the University of Missouri and much in love at the time. Somewhere in the fever of their relationship came the idea of starting a literary magazine. And according to Larry's typically candid confession to me some years later, the idea was more Marcia's than his. This was the aftermath of the 60s, time when there's something of a black hole in my memory, but I do remember the basic facts. I was a fiction writer and literature professor at the university. The period leading up to the first issue of the magazine was such a daze of work that I don't remember much about it except sitting in my cramped office at the back of the bungalow I shared with my wife. On winter nights, I remember the slight rattle of the fan of the coiled heater in that office and the drunk and hungry howls coming from the nearby fraternity parking lot. In 1978, the year we started the magazine, I finally got my wish and published my first novel. But rather than feeling satisfied, of course, it only fueled my desire to go to work on a second, hopefully better one. I genuinely liked Larry and Marcia. However, they sometimes had the effect of reminding you of what you were missing. They were demonstrative in their affection. Marcia was and still is sunny, cheerful, vivacious, and best sense of the term, wonderfully normal. Larry was a bit spacey and charming, but not much of a talker. In casual conversation, he sometimes didn't know what to say or even what tone to take. His typical reply was, "Gee, I don't know. I just don't know," uttered in a kind of velvety voice that he seemed to be borrowing for the moment. There's a trend today of professional poets becoming entertainers, performing timed routines of jokes and poems at readings. Their poems are too often a bland serving of 2 cups of irony and 2 cups of sentiment, carefully measured. Larry was anything but a performer. At readings, he would simply walk up to the dais in his shabby blue jeans and break your heart with his melancholy, somehow ethereal poetry. One evening around the time we inaugurated our first issue of the Missouri Review, Larry and Marcia came to our house for dinner with a certain quite famous writer who shall remain unnamed for reasons that will become apparent. We had hired him for a reading in residency. It was winter and a fire was in the fireplace, wine flowing freely. The author had brought an attractive female student with him from the school where he was a visiting professor. And before long, the two of them, as well as Marcia and Larry, were all making out like 8th graders. The author and his young girlfriend were on the floor beside the fireplace and obviously not the least bit interested in talking. His wife called long distance in the midst of this, demanding to speak to her husband, saying she knew what was going on. She knew exactly what was going on in Missouri. It was a good thing someone knew what was going on in Missouri because none of us did. Like a lot of things that begin in romance, we were tumbling headlong into a commitment that none of us really grasped at the time. Larry and Marcia moved away, leaving the magazine with the rest of us. I became editor for the reason that one becomes secretary of the student council, because no one else would do it. Our problem in those early years was finding good writing, and I quickly got my first experience in the embarrassment of inviting material from authors and when it wasn't up to par, having to reject it. As the years passed, I unaccountably found myself growing more interested in the magazine. Bill Peden, the senior person among the writing faculty, who I secretly regarded as godfather figure, once looked at me shook his head and said, as if musing aloud to himself, "Who would ever have guessed you would have become an editor?" Looking around, I thought the same could be said about the rest of us on the Missouri Review staff. We were a ragged bunch. We had no money. Our magazine didn't have clear use of a single resource, not even a typewriter. Through the 80s, we were hanging on by our fingertips financially, but coming around to a more solid idea of what kind of magazine we were. The 90s were a decade of big changes. For one thing, our submitters had grown in volume and I'd say improved in quality, a result of partly of creative writing programs springing up across the country and of the magazine's growing reputation. By then we had published or were soon to publish writers who were either important or becoming important in international letters. Writers as varied as Charles Wright, Galway Kinnell, William Goyen, Richard Ford, Stanislaw Lem, the great Polish writer, Diane Johnson, Mary Lee Settle, Chinua Achebe, Bobby Ann Mason, and Rita Dove, to name just a few. These are only a few of the over 1,000 authors that we have published in 30 years. To all of you, we say thank you for making us what we are, and we hope to discover another wonderful group of writers over the next 30 years.